Hey, I'm so excited. Samantha Fountain here, and I am starting a series called Haunted History and Rubber Bands, where we do science experiments, blow things up, and talk about some haunted history around the world. And I thought, what better place to start than my home city of Charleston? So buckle up, this is gonna be crazy. First thing we are going to explode is a watermelon with a ton of rubber bands. Are we ready? Yeah, I think we're ready. We're gonna start with one of my absolute favorite haunted locations, the Charleston Old City Jail. I've been to this location a couple of times on a tour, and it leaves you frightened, to say the least. The old Charleston jail was originally located on a 4-acre parcel set aside for public use in 1680. At the time of Charleston's earliest settlement, it was operating as the Charleston County Jail from 1802 until 1939. It housed Charleston's most infamous criminals and federal prisoners of war. When the jail was constructed in 1802, it consisted of 4 stories. The old jail housed a great variety of inmates: John and Lavinia Fisher and other members of their gang. Convicted of highway robbery, they were imprisoned there between 1819 and 1820. Some of the last 19th century high seas pirates were also jailed here in 1822 while they awaited to be hung. Some slaves were briefly held in the jail, and 4 white men convicted of supporting the 1822 plot were imprisoned there. During the Civil War, Confederate and federal prisoners of war were also held and incarcerated there. This brings me to one of my absolute favorite ghost stories. Let me tell you about Lavinia Fisher. This is a Charleston ghost story. It's a violent mix of greed and beauty. Charleston exudes an eerie calmness that can be felt on many nights. One of the most compelling of these characters is Lavinia Fisher. She set a violent precedent, making herself a legend as the country's first female serial killer. The spirit of Lavinia and her partner in crime, her husband John, are said to haunt the streets of Charleston, where they were hanged 2 centuries ago. Lavinia was born in 1793 in Charleston, the same city she would face death by execution 26 years later. Little is known about her early life, making the circumstances leading to her short life of crime a mystery. She married John Fisher, and the couple made Charleston their home. Lavinia and John ran an inn just outside the Charleston area known as the 6 Mile House. It's now the site of the Old Navy Hospital. It was a temporary home for travelers that were visiting the area on their way to trade goods. These travelers, they were often returning from doing business and carrying loads of cash for the goods they sold. And many of the guests, they didn't realize upon their arrival that it would be their last stop. The proximity to town also made the inn a popular choice for gangsters and highwaymen. Add to that, these villains were welcomed in by the Fishers, creating a recipe for turmoil and tragedy. The hangout became a breeding ground for the gangsters to begin cheating innocent guests out of their money. But those pots weren't enough for Lavinia and John. They knew the guests that frequented their rooms were businessmen and tradesmen that often carried lots of cash and valuable belongings. Together, they devised a complex plan to profit from the fortune of their guests. Legend has it that Lavinia was quite the seductress. She would lure male visitors in to stay with her stunning beauty and flirtatious appeal. She would chat them up in her comforting ways. She made them trust her. As their hostess, they ultimately let their guard down. Lavinia served comfort food and tea laced with oleander. Infused with the toxic shrub, the tea induced warm sleepiness in her guests. Lavinia would play the ever-gracious host, refilling their mugs and turning on the charm. The men, they would eventually fall into a deep slumber. So that's where John came in. Seduced by the opportunity for an easy jackpot, he would rob the patrons in their sleep. Some likely overdosed on the potent tea, though those that didn't would be stabbed to death by their hosts. To cover his tracks, John would hide their dismembered bodies in the cellar of the inn. It was also rumored that a trap door was installed into the floor under the guest beds. When the men would become drowsy and retire to bed, the door would drop them to the cellar below. They would plunge to their deaths. This allowed John to pillage their cash piles. Though the Fisher couple was well liked in the town, suspicions they started swirling as more and more men continued to disappear. So the locals, they gathered that the common factor was the victim's last known whereabouts, which was at the 6 Mile house. You know, they were also getting fed up by the nature of the illegal gang-related activity and the highwaymen's cheating that was taking place at that very inn. So there was finally a witness account for the Fisher couple after the growing suspicions, and that led to a formation of a local group to investigate the activity in February of 1819. They visited the 6 Mile house to inquire about the gang activities that were going on and to put a stop to them. Being optimistic that they succeeded and eliminated the rough crowd, they decided to retreat back to town. However, they left David Ross to monitor the area for a resurgence of the highwaymen. The very next morning, Ross himself was the victim of an attack. He found himself face to face with 2 of the highwaymen. Upon seeing the familiar face of Lavinia Fisher, he was hopeful she would aid him in his escape. He quickly realized that she was working in cooperation with the 2 men. Her violent actions shocked and surprised him. Instead of the help he initially expected, Lavinia choked him before smashing a window pane with his head. He recounted that the men continued to beat him and even fired a gun as he was able to wrangle free. After this glimpse of Lavinia's evil side, Ross was able to return to Charleston to share the story of her blind outrage. And then there was a second survivor from Lavinia's attempt of murder. Mere hours later, Trader John arrived from Georgia looking for a room. Despite the recent chaos, Lavinia calmly explained that there were no vacancies. However, she graciously invited him in for a break from his travels. Even though Pebbles despised tea, he courteously accepted the cup that Lavinia offered. Patiently waiting until she was distracted, he discreetly poured the toxic tea into a houseplant. John Fisher was quickly growing impatient and wondering why the tea hadn't affected the man and given him his opportunity for the easy robbery that he wanted to do. Lavinia continued to stall and ask Pebbles countless questions and making polite chit-chat, hoping her potion to finally take effect. When it was obvious that Pebbles remained wide awake, Lavinia knew she had to switch tactics. She suddenly stated that a room spontaneously became available. In the quiet of his room, Pebbles began to reflect on the series of suspicious events of the evening. Why had Lavinia asked so many questions while her husband eerily just looked on? The more he thought about it, the more his suspicions grew that he was a target for robbery, and this majorly irked him. His instincts prompted Pebbles to sleep in the room's chair for the evening. A loud crash awoke him abruptly from his light slumber. Pebbles was shocked and thankful when he opened his eyes to see that the bed intended for his night of sleep had disappeared into the floor. He fled quickly at this point through the window, not looking back until he arrived on horseback in Charleston. At this point, he was eager to tell law enforcement about the terrifying occurrence. Pebbles provided a detailed deposition to authorities that showed similarities in the violence that David Ross had experienced. These accounts months were enough to prompt law enforcement to arrest Lavinia and John Fisher, as well as their 2 accomplices. The sheriff's office raided the 6 Mile house and thoroughly searched for any evidence of the missing men. The grounds, they were torn apart, and possessions of the disappeared visitors were uncovered. Lavinia's sleeping potion and trapdoor apparatus were even discovered, making the pair's MO clear and very, very obvious. Some say that the basement was littered with the remains of hundreds of travelers. Others say that no bodies were found at all. But one thing that is consistently true is that it is believed those missing guests never made it out of the inn. There was a prolonged prison stay for Lavinia and John. They adamantly claimed complete innocence. Though they pled not guilty, they were not given the opportunity for bond and forced to await their trial in prison. However, their 2 violent accomplices were released on bail. Finally, in May of 1819, their trial began. Though a murder conviction was ultimate goal, the jury hung in disagreement. However, based on the number of possessions that were found in the basement, the jury was able to convict the Fishers on multiple highway robbery charges. This was a capital offense at the time, and it was punishable by hanging. After requesting an appeal, John and Lavinia returned to their small, shattered prison cell. The wait for the next court session was long, giving them time to orchestrate their escape with 2 other prisoners that were there. They had spent their time creating a hole in the prison wall and crafting a rope out of the linens in their cell. John was able to use the knotted rope to climb out of the prison walls before the rope broke. The 2 other prisoners also escaped. Lavinia then remained trapped, alone in the cell. The ever-loyal husband, John, returned to his wife in prison, and the guards increased their watch over the crafty couple. Lavinia Fisher, she attempted one last appeal in February of 1820. That was nearly a year after their encounters with their escaped victims. A constitutional court was called to hear their appeal. The court rejected the couple's appeal, leaving them with no further options. So at that point, their execution was scheduled for later in the month to allow the couple time to make peace with God. At this point, the Reverend Richard Furman was summoned to come in. He was tasked with saving the couple's souls. John pleaded with the Reverend to help him rid his spirit of evil. Lavinia, however, avoided any efforts to redeem herself of her heinous crimes. On the fateful morning of February the 18th in 1820, the couples were led on their final walk to the gallows behind the Charleston Old City Jail. John, he carried his newly found peace and spirituality and asked the Reverend to read a letter that he had penned to the crowd of 2,000 people waiting for his execution. He persisted to say that he was completely innocent of any crime and claimed that he was a victim of the broken judicial system, and he empathetically begged the crowd for their forgiveness. Lavinia, however, refused to go quietly to her death. Desperate for a last-minute pardon, she made quite a show and had to be forcefully carried to the gallows. Insisting on wearing her wedding gown, she caused a loud, profanity-filled, dramatic scene. Her stomping, screaming, and violent refusal was a stark contrast to the peaceful acceptance that her husband had shown. Instead of asking for forgiveness or pleading for her life, Lavinia blamed the local socialites among the group for their influence over her conviction. Her rambunctious behavior made it difficult for the executioners to properly tighten the noose around her neck. In one final act of defiance, Lavinia leaped from the platform by her own will, hanging lifeless over the crowd of onlookers. Before she jumped to her own death, she shouted her last bold words. This is what she said: "If you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me, I'll carry it." The stunned crowd was left with these last words. The wicked smile on Lavinia's face as her soul left the gallows would be engraved in their minds forever. Witnesses would recount the tale, ending with her empty, dead stare for years to come. The couple's bodies were likely laid to rest at the nearby Pottersfield Cemetery, This was not unusual for convicted criminals with no family to lay claim to their remains. It is said that Lavinia's ghost still haunts the old Charleston jail today. Lavinia would live on in infamy as the first female serial killer in the United States. The mystery surrounding Lavinia's early life and the dramatic way that she ended it makes her a compelling and interesting character, to say the least. Her empathetic claim of innocence up until the very end can cause doubt and conspiracy theories. What remains true is that Lavinia hung angrily from the gallows of Charleston. The reports of strange occurrences began with the restoration efforts in 2000, and one of the first reports was workers finding footprints in the dust after the building had been locked off for months due to lead paint contamination. More and more of these strange occurrences were happening as the preservation continued and the building was opened for tours. Several apparitions have been reported, including several workers who saw the ghost of a jailer with a rifle on the 3rd floor. The phantom was said to have passed through the bars heading toward them before it vanished. Others have reported seeing a black man in ragged clothing wandering aimlessly through the halls. Thought to be the spirit of a former slave, the man is seemingly unaware of the living. But the old jail's most famous ghost is Lavinia Fisher. Several who have visited the historic building often claim to have seen a woman in her wedding dress, describing it as being bright red and white. Often, strange sounds are heard throughout the building, including the hum of a dumbwaiter moving through the floors, even though it hasn't been operational in years. Alarms are said to go off and on randomly. Visitors and employees alike have complained of a choking feeling and shortness of breath. Others report being grabbed, pushed, touched, and scratched by unseen forces. In the basement, even though the temperatures may be quite warm, visitors have seen their breath come out in a cloud of fog. Now, access to the jail is limited and most easily accessed through various ghost tour companies. The television show Ghost Hunters season premiere featured a visit to the old Charleston jail. This is where a skeptical camera operator experienced the scratches firsthand, which were visible on camera. I thoroughly had enjoyed the tour that I had taken. I've done it a couple times, like I said, and did have a really weird occurrence. We were in the last room and he had shut off the lights, and my son, who was 3 at the time, was with me and in my arms, and my brother, who was visiting, was on this tour with us as well. So the lights were off, and all of a sudden I felt someone tugging on my son, like he was being pulled away, and I got scared. I said, "Knock it off," to my brother, who I thought was the one doing it, and the tour guide got nervous because he heard the fear in my voice, and he turned on the lights, and my brother was on the other side of the room, y'all.
It's a sign.
I hope you enjoyed the story of Lavinia.